I've got illusions that I'm taller than I actually am, so I'm hoping the roadies are going to show up eventually. Enjoyed the wall of sound when we saluted the shrine earlier. And so maybe I could just repeat Sadhanandi's welcome from yesterday evening. Lovely to have everybody here, and lovely to have people from different quarters of the country and from Europe. Sadhu Jala this morning told me I was quite relieved to hear actually that Nitya Bandhu will be doing simultaneous translation for the Polish group. So if you hear a conversation going on in that corner, it's not a hope that the group's got bored, it's actually translation going on. And it did make me wonder if we should have extended the same courtesy to the native English speakers. I'll do my best. Stay with me. So, over the weekend, we're going to be looking, well, in a way, we're going to be looking almost at an aphorism, a single image. And the image is the theme of the weekend, is the taste of freedom. Those of you who are wondering what the Pali for the taste of freedom is, I want to just give you that information right now. Of course, it is Vimutti Rasa. And the phrase Vimutti Rasa comes from a particular Pali text, one of a set of verses called the Udana, where the Buddha is giving a description of what the Dharma's like and what the experience of the Dharma, what the experience of the teachings is like. And he doesn't go in very metaphysically. He starts off really concrete and starts off with a set of metaphors. And the metaphors, he begins with 8 strange and wonderful things about the mighty ocean. Sangharakshit, in a lecture that he did about this text, said that the Buddha had probably never seen the ocean. The Buddha lived in north-central India, hundreds if not thousands of miles from the ocean. So what he knew about the ocean would have been by hearsay. Nevertheless, he had these 8 strange and wonderful things. And then he went on to make the comparison with the Dharma and said there are 8 strange and wonderful things about the Dharma. And the one that we're going to focus on over the weekend, and it's probably one of the most sort of well-known, I'm going to say, definitions of evocations of what the Dharma is. He says, just as the great ocean has a single taste, so the taste of salt, so the Dharma has a single taste, the taste of freedom, the Vimutti Rasa. So this is so central to what the Dharma is, pitches it pretty high, actually, that this description of liberation, of freedom that the Mutti is trying to get at. So over the weekend, we're going to just try and draw out some of the implications of this idea of the taste of the Dharma being the taste of freedom. And even we're going to look at this idea of a taste. So we'll begin with talks each morning. Excuse me for not introducing myself. My name's Dhammarati. I'm part of the teaching community here. It's what comes of having things in a mind map rather than actually printed out. And Sadhanandi tomorrow, Kema Bandhu the day after. Each of us will look at one aspect of this taste of freedom. And each morning, we're going to follow it with meditation. And this shift from a bit of a discussion, a bit of an unpacking of the idea, and then moving into meditation. It's very traditional. There's a little definition of wisdom in the Buddhist tradition that talks about it as having three aspects. And the first aspect is what's called wisdom through hearing. And that the idea is that we're taking in something that we hadn't understood before, we hadn't really reflected on before. And that's seen as an important part of the process of us broadening out, deepening our own experience. But this emphasis on taste, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute, that wisdom through hearing then becomes what's called wisdom through reflection. How do we take an idea and how do we turn it into something that really makes an impact on our own experience? And the third of the wisdoms is called wisdom through meditation. But really what it means is having had a glimpse of something, having allowed it to go a little bit deeper, our experience starts to shift in line with it. So something that we've had a glimpse of, we gradually start to get a more direct experience of. So that this emphasis on, for some people listening, the hearing, the study is going to be the kind of main route into something deeper. For other people, the personal reflection, the closer look at our own experience is going to be the main route. But they support each other. So I hope over the weekend, through the talks, through the meditation, we'll manage to have this kind of exploration, a little bit of what the text is getting at. The meditations are going to be hung around a practice called anapanasati. And I like the Pali and the Pali terminology, but actually, really, anapanasati just means mindfulness of breathing. That's the practice. Anapana is in and out breath. Sati is mindfulness. So anapanasati is just mindfulness of the in and out breath. And the four-stage practice that we do in Triratna is part of this teaching on mindfulness of the in and out breath. It's the sort of early part of a set of verses. But in Anapanasati, there's a bit that precedes it, and there's quite a lot that follows this first attention to the breath. And when I first came across this text, I got really interested in the instructions. Apparently it's the longest bit of meditation teaching in the Pali Canon. So that there's a lot of really helpful, practical information about how to deepen meditation practice. But the bit beforehand, it's the Buddha, it's a description of the Buddha and the monks that he's talking to, the bhikkhus that he's talking to. And more, as I got more familiar with this text, and I kind of got past the slightly formal instructions. But Buddhism was an oral tradition for hundreds of years before it was written down. And as a way of remembering what was said, the language took on a certain kind of structure and a certain kind of formality. So when you read the texts, they've got a certain shape, they've got a certain flavour, to use the word. But actually realising more and more that behind that technical description, behind that instruction of meditation, what you've got is a human being. You've got someone who the Buddhist tradition regards as enlightened, as awakened. And it's this figure of the Buddha trying to describe what his experience of awareness is like. And this awareness is a really central aspect of what the experience of waking up is like. So before it's a meditation instruction, before it's anything very formal, it's somebody with this deeper experience of awareness, basically just saying, look, it's like this is what it feels like, and trying to describe it in a way that gives us a direct taste of it, that gives us access to the experience. We hear it, we get a glimmer of it, and it's presented in a way that gives us a connection with it in experience. So this whole image of a taste, this whole image of us moving from something that comes in maybe as an idea to begin with, it becomes something much more immediate, like our tongue touching salt in water. You know what you've just touched, and you don't know it as an idea, you know it as a direct, immediately felt, sensed experience that has more and more of an impact on us. So with the Buddha describing the Dharma as having, as the ocean has the taste of salt, the Dharma has the taste of freedom. So what we're being encouraged to do, what the tradition trying to give us access to, is what that experience of freedom is like. So first thing to say about the Dharma having one taste is the way the mighty ocean has a taste. So it's a taste of freedom. And I was thinking a bit about that. A lot of early Buddhism stays with very simple language. I was going to say I'm wading my way. I'm getting all these ocean metaphors are coming to mind. I'm wading my way at the minute through a text on the Yogacara. And that the Yogacara is one of the sort of later texts. It brings in quite a sophisticated model of the mind. But that the Yogacara happens maybe 400 or 500 years after the early teachings. And it's not that the early teachings don't have their philosophical sophistication, but they're always trying to chunk it down to how the idea that's being described impacts on our experience. And quite often the language of early Buddhism, when it's trying to talk about what it is it's pointing towards, uses very concrete, very vivid language. So, for example, in the Metta Sutta, it talks about enlightenment, but it talks about it in terms of the good. And in a way, it talks about it in terms of what we viscerally feel is good for us, what it is that's important to us. And the Dharma is always trying to talk to that deep felt sense of what it is that matters to us, what in our own life, in our own understanding, we feel is most deeply important. And this language of freedom, in the same way, as trying to touch that drive in us towards something that just instinctively feels like it has value for us and instinctively feels that it matters to us. So freedom, before it's a philosophical idea, it's trying to touch something that's a strong flavour in our experience. Oh, slow down. So the Polish speakers and the English speakers are having trouble keeping up. I love this stuff, and then I get excited, and once I get excited, I need somebody walking around with me all the time just saying, look, slow down. So, right, back into to the water. Yeah, so it's trying to speak to what we feel, this intuitive sense in our own lives about what deeply matters to us. So you've got this language of freedom, this image of freedom. So then you've got to start to ask, what is it that... So freedom's a translation. It's a translation of the idea of vimutti. what is it that within the Buddhist tradition Vimutti is trying to point to? So you get this metaphor a lot in the Pali Canon. You get metaphors of being in jail, metaphors of being in debt, metaphors of carrying a heavy weight, metaphors of being in chains. Fetter, which we'll be talking about later, is an image of our mind in chains. And what the image of freedom is trying to get at is what our minds are like when it's freed from debt, when it's let out of jail, when it's let out of the chains that imprison us, that tie us down. So what's that experience like? So in the text, Sangharakshita, in the lecture on the text, is saying that it's freedom from three things. So this is quite a traditional description of the Dharma. Freedom from what's called three fetters. Again, this image of something that binds us, something that traps us. So the three fetters, if you come across them traditionally, first fetter is belief in a separate, unchanging self. So this is the famous Buddhist teaching of anatta, which gets translated sometimes as no self. Second fetter that we free ourselves from is attachment to religious observances as ends in themselves. And the third of the three fetters is doubt. In the lecture, Sangharakshita is trying to do what the whole tradition does. So I don't know how many of you are aware of these teachings. Don't know how many of you are aware of this idea of Buddhism wanting to move us beyond this idea of a fixed, separate, unchanging self. Right, so that might be familiar conceptual ground. What does that mean? What's that pointing at? In experience, what's that like? And it can so easily sound like we sort of pop out of existence. So assuming that that's not what it's getting at, what's it trying to get at? What does it mean to break the fetter of attachment to religious observances? What does it mean to go beyond doubt? I've met the odd zealot in my time. I'm from a culture that values a little bit of healthy scepticism. So what does it mean to break the fetter of doubt in our experience? So Sangharakshita does, in his commentary, what the whole tradition does and tries to chunk it down to something tangible and experiential. It does a translation. In the first translation that he does, he says, moving beyond belief in a fixed permanent self isn't something conceptual. Basically, you're looking at what he describes as habit. So it's not an idea, it's the sense that our whole being, our awareness, our behaviour, the way we understand things, the way we respond to things, is very deeply habitually shaped. So first translation is habit. And then he goes on to say that dependence on rites and rituals or religious observances, you could think of in terms of superficiality. And to go beyond superficiality, you're moving into what he describes as commitment. To go beyond doubt, you're looking, or doubt he translates as vagueness. And to go beyond vagueness, you start to move into an experience of clarity. So tomorrow, Sadhananda will talk about superficiality and commitment. Day after, Kemabandhu will talk about vagueness and clarity. And today I just want to spend a little bit more time on this idea of habit and what it is that it's pointing us towards. First of all, I think it's a brilliant translation. When I came across this idea of no self, it can't but be a bit kind of psychedelic and a little bit head banging, and trying to get what it's getting at and just to ground it. So I'll quote, actually, Sangharakshita says, a habit is something that we're said to, that we have particular habits. He says it's different from that. In fact, we are our actions. That the way the Buddhist tradition sees the human being, sees the human mind, is that we are the sum total of actions of body, speech, and mind. So it's not that we've got a self that in turn has habits. What we're describing as ourselves is this shape that the flow of experience is taking in actions of our body, actions of how we communicate, how we interact, actions of mind, thoughts, feelings, and so on. That's what a habit is. Well, that's what an action is. And then this idea in the Buddhist tradition that we act out of very deep habits, that the habits of the mind are quite deeply rooted and quite deeply enmeshed. One of the ways that you get a sense of that is if you try to meditate. So I'm sure some of you in the room are highly skilled meditators, right? So it's not you that I'm speaking to, it's the rest of us. But try to get to 10 breaths, right? I've been meditating, don't want to discourage anybody here, but I've been meditating for 40 plus years, and on a good day, I'm really good at getting to 10 often, right? But I can still have my days where I sit down and around about the 3 or 4 mark, something more pressing comes to my mind, and my mind is off this way and that. It's when you start to plug in to a sustained experience of awareness that you start to get a direct taste of how much our minds habitually resist that and how much the habits take us somewhere else. So you could say a lot about us. I'm just going to very quickly use a framework called the 5 hindrances. Right? The 5 hindrances are basically describing habits of mind. So when you try to pay attention to something, one of the habits that we hit is noticing that our minds, rather than trying to stay open, start to fixate on certain bits of our experience. There's bits where the mind wants to go and bits where the mind doesn't want to go. So we lose the openness, we lose the responsiveness, what the Buddhist tradition calls the habit of craving. So one bit of our experience becomes more significant, more important than another. Second one is the habit of when we touch an experience that we don't like, the habit of pushing it away. Third habit of you're trying to settle the mind, and the mind has no intentions of settling. It's just doing what it does, producing ideas, producing trains of thought, producing little fantasies, little pictures. Habit of restlessness. The mind's always slightly hyper-vigilant, even when it doesn't need to be. Then the opposite of that, you may have encountered. You start to take awareness into the experience and you get tired. It's an effort to pay attention to something. So you get the tendency to close down and pull in. You get the tendency to push away. You get the tendency for the mind to be restless. You get the tendency for the mind to be sluggish. And then there's a fifth one, which is you start to feel something deeper open up and you go, wait a minute, is this okay? And you kind of step back from what we could have chosen to step into. So when you start to make the effort to be aware, that's when you start to get a sense of how deeply rooted the habits are. The Buddhist tradition doesn't speculate much about why, but I was reading a Buddhist writer recently sort of trying to root it a bit in evolutionary biology. And he says basically what the mind's interested in is, first of all, can I eat it? And that's craving. The second thing is the mind wants to know, can it eat me? That's the tendency to push away. And the third one is, if I can't eat it, and if it can't eat me, it doesn't matter. So we just don't pay attention. So that would be one, perhaps, sense of why those habits are so deeply rooted. They come out of patterns of behaviour, patterns of response that have been thousands of years in the making. And in spiritual practice, you're starting to work against those habits and into a deeper, clearer seeing of what experience is like. There's this beautiful image in the Buddhist tradition, what's called the ox herding pictures. And it's basically a cartoon strip of what meditation is like. And it starts off with this kid who's this little frail boy trying to handle an ox. Right? So our meditation experience often starts off with the child of our self-awareness trying to deal with the ox of our habits. Sangha goes on to say, the mind has got into those habits, and if we've got into them, what we feel is a fixed separate self, he says, is simply a habit that our stream of consciousness has got into. And if our stream of consciousness has got into it, it can get out of it. So the whole framework of Buddhist practice are the instructions of how the mind gets out of these deeply ingrained habits that trap us. So, say a little bit about that. First of all, I wanted to mention a second metaphor from this set of images about how the Dharma is like the ocean. And this one is that, according to the Buddha, the ocean deepens gradually. So there's the little first centimetre of water where the water touches the shore. And then you get this gradual descent into depth. Whether or not that's true of the ocean, west coast of Scotland, I'm not so sure. But the Buddha says the Dharma's like that there are no sudden dramatic drops. It's this process of gradual deepening. And to me, this is an incredibly attractive aspect of the Dharma. Every morning here we chant a text called the Tiratna Vandana. And it's, again, in there's a description of the Dharma. And the Dharma is described as ehipassiko. And ehipassiko means, it gets translated as of the nature of a personal invitation. So it's not that the Dharma imposes an obligation on us. It's trying to speak to what matters to us. And we can choose to engage with the Dharma at a level that feels like it speaks to that deeper current in us. Sangha says in the lecture, some of us are going to want to plunge in. For some of us who are not quite ready to plunge in, we can at least decide to go for a paddle. So you've got this sense of you choose the extent to which you engage with these practices. And that element of, even there's the taste of freedom. The quality of our engagement with the Dharma right from the start has the taste of freedom. And the transition, the first step into that water, Sangha talking about undoing the habits. He says we do it, according to the teachings, by being more continually aware and more emotionally positive. So they're the key points. I always feel it sounds a little anticlimactic Like another famous story of a Chinese teacher speaking to the Emperor of China. The Emperor of China waiting for the teaching, and the teacher says, "Stop doing evil, try to do good, purify the mind." And the Emperor says, "Is that it?" And the teacher says, "Yep, that's it." So another aphorism of Sangharakshita is, there are no higher teachings, there are only deeper understandings. Buddhism, the mature experience of Buddhism, gets described as wisdom and compassion. But those flavours of wisdom and compassion turn up, the same flavour, right at the start of practice. They turn up as a bit more of a sustained effort to pay attention, and a bit more of a shift away from emotional resistance into opening and into connection. So that the practice starts with a more sustained experience of awareness and a more sustained experience of more emotional positivity, kindness, if you want to use the language. And on the basis of that move into attention and that move into connection is the move out of the resistance of habit and into what Sangharakshita talks about as creativity. And it's creativity in the sense of something new and deeper is emerging. And it's creativity in the sense of something that we just were not paying attention to. We're starting to notice something as simple as the breath. Right? You sit down, you get a bit concentrated, and the breath is this world of sensation. Look, Lama Govinda has a beautiful essay about the breath, and he says it's halfway between mind and body. We can pay attention to it, but we feel it in the body. Breath is mind and body. He says it's conscious and it's unconscious. If we don't pay attention, it'll carry on perfectly happily. But if you choose to, you can change it. You could decide to hold your breath, you could decide to have a deep breath, decide to have a shallow breath. So it's between conscious and unconscious. And even deeper, it's self and it's world. 1 minute it's air. You breathe it in and it's breath. And then you breathe it out and it's world again. So if you want to know what one of the implications of this softening of the boundary of a fixed separate self, you're looking at this flow of something that's world becoming self, something that's self becoming world, and this seamless flow in between the two. So what we think of as the most prosaic experience possible, you start to pay attention and something deeper than that begins to open up. So the whole Buddhist path starts with this attention on the richness of experience. Sangharakshita in the lecture locates this idea of the muti in a traditional sequence called the nidanas. Nidanas just means links. And if you come across this idea of the links in Buddhism, again, it can seem like this sort of philosophical kind of proposal about what experience is like. But it's trying to point to something much more immediate than that. So what it's saying is that as experience starts to open up, it's not random what opens up. There's a shape to it. And if we become aware of the shape, we support its emergence. And what the nidanas are trying to do are describe the shape that experience takes as we start to move out of the habits and setting up this space of awareness and kindness. So if you've got the patience just for a minute, I want to go through that sequence of the nidanas. And I want to do it because I think it gives you the flavour, it gives you a bit of a taste of what Vimutti is getting at. So the nidanas, what's called the positive nidanas, start off with this experience of shraddha. And shraddha gets translated as faith. And you almost can't but misunderstand what Shraddha's getting at. Faith, like my experience of faith was on a Sunday morning in a Church of Scotland Sunday school, right? And it's not an experience I want to repeat anytime soon. So for me at least, faith has connotations that aren't there in the original language. What Shraddha is trying to get to, I think, is this intuitive sense of something deeper and something that speaks to that drive in us to be free. So it's just this sense of you get a glimmer of what that could be like. And that intuitive sense is maybe something of what Shraddha's getting at. Shraddha's followed by something that gets translated as delight. And what that means, I think, is the sense that we're starting to act in a way that puts us in touch with that deeper sense of ourselves. So it's not delight in the sense that, you start to enjoy your experience. It's delight in the sense of this feels right, that this feels like it's plugging us into a deeper sense of ourselves. So that first sense of delight. Delight becomes what's called piti, piti and then sukha. Piti gets translated as bliss. Now, again, I don't know about you, but to me that was next to useless as a description of what it was that I was moving towards. I didn't have that much experience of bliss. But what Piti's getting at, I think, is that from this sense of intuitive connection to something deeper, when our actions, so for example, we start to act in a way that's a little kinder, we start to act in a way that's a bit more content, we start to act in a way where our communication's a little more thoughtful, a little more responsive to the people that we're talking to. Those shifts in the actions open up a space that starts to include more and more of our own awareness of ourselves. And it's an experience of becoming more alive, an experience of waking up. That's why Buddhism uses so many metaphors of being set free, being released, being awake. So piti, I think, what bliss is getting at is the sense of us having more access to our own deeper life and how deeply satisfying that starts to become. And again, we're stepping into water that gradually deepens. We're not going to go from our minds all over the place to an experience of bliss. But step by step, inch by inch, we find a way to connect with those deeper currents in ourselves. We start to recognise what supports that experience. We start to recognise what blocks it. And we sort of learn to move towards that emerging current in our experience. Piti and sukha become what's called samadhi. And samadhi gets translated as concentration. And again, there's something in that. But really what samadhi is getting at is what it's like when all of those parts of ourselves that we didn't pay attention to, and all of those parts of ourselves that we actively resisted, and the boundary that we drew between ourselves and the world around us, when all of that starts to soften, it becomes a sort of flowing together of a single experience and awareness. And that deep flowing together, that's what concentration is trying to get at. It's that sense of, well, D.H. Lawrence calls it the whole person wholly attending. So that's maybe what the samadhi is trying to get at. And then from samadhi, it moves into what's called insight, or the translation is knowledge and vision of things as they are. But really, again, I don't want to be reductive about this, but it's a bit like when all of that energy has come together, when the mind isn't being pulled out into its usual habits, there's a stillness and a depth. And out of that stillness and depth, we start to see more clearly. We just see our own experience more clearly, the world around us more clearly. Traditional images of the mind is blue sky. And the blue sky gradually has been obscured by cloud, and the cloud just gradually dissipates, and we're left with the experience of blue sky. So it's that sense of seeing something clearly. It's that release into that open, clear experience of mind. And just catch up with myself. So the reason I mention that, so this technically is, as I say, the sort of Buddhist experience of insight. It's from that depth and clarity that the habit of clinging, or the tendency of the mind to habitually cling, for the mind to skate over the surface, for the mind to hold back from experience. Out of that deepening process, we step into something that Sangharakshita describes as creativity. Creativity in the sense of something of real depth starting to emerge into awareness. And I want just to come back again to this metaphor of the ocean deepens gradually. Right? I think it's worth going through that sequence, because even though it's pointing to something deep, there's a flavour. There's the taste of salt, there's the taste of freedom in our first connection with deeper practice. Right? But before you do anything else, just to sit down and to find out how you pay attention in a little more of an effective way. To find out whether we feel a bit disconnected, and what would it be like for that to soften and to move into connection with ourselves, with the people round about us. And in that movement into attention, in that movement into connection, you've got the first tongue tip taste of the salt, the flavour that the later the tradition's describing as awakening, has that taste right from the beginning. So what we hope we're going to manage to do over the weekend is just point a bit to what the text is getting at. And in the practice, in the discussion, in our connection with each other, just seeing, can we set up the conditions that nudge us out of the habit a little bit and into a deeper quality of connection with ourselves, with the people around us, to the extent that we want to step into that water.